The night I saved the man who destroyed my life. I never believed in theatrical moments. My life had been a slow accumulation of small losses, a quiet erosion of plans, an inventory of things I didn't know how to fix. Then one rainy November night, under the flutter of sodium streetlights and the smell of wet asphalt, I found myself crouched over a man whose face I had hated for a year. I held his head in my hands while my memory, dissonant and sharp, rewound the way things have fallen apart. In that instant, the world made a cruel kind of sense. The person who had taken everything from me was bleeding, weak, and very human. A year earlier, my life had a certain geometry. I had a steady job managing accounts at a small marketing firm, a modest apartment, and a little daughter who could make me laugh without meaning to. I was not brilliant. I was reliable. I paid my bills on time, answered emails politely, and thought we were building something ordinary and good. Then my manager, Alexei, signed a series of documents that unspooled my life. He convinced the board that our projects weren't delivering. He rewrote reports, withheld emails, forged metrics, little nothings collected into a tidal wave. Contracts evaporated. Clients left without explanation. I watched our company tolerate his lies because he wore the right suits and smiled for the right people. The consequences for me were not immediate theater, no dramatic firing with applause, but slow, devastating attrition. First, the promotions I'd planned never materialized. Then the bigger accounts, the ones that kept the lights on, were reassigned. I spent nights drafting cover letters and mornings returning to a job where my name felt like a stain. When we finally lost a key client, the company cut several positions. I was one of them. Losing my job was the hinge that opened everything else. We had been renting, saving, pretending to be safe. With no steady income, the bank calls started. My wife, who had carried her own private anxieties for a long time in a way I pretended not to notice, began to change. She confessed she was tired. Not of me exactly, of the scramble, the constant postponement of comfort, the endless defense against an invisible slide. A month later, she took our daughter and left, telling me she needed a stable person to tuck their life into. She told me, gently, but with a finality I still didn't know was possible, that she could no longer wait for a recovery that might never come. Anger was the simplest feeling at first. Anger required no introspection. It had clear targets. Alexei's name was at the center of my cursing. He'd lied, betrayed, stolen more than a job. He had stolen my daughter's ordinary childhood, the nights with my wife, the faith in myself that paid the mortgage and made coffee on a weekday morning. I vowed never to see him again. I pictured him humiliated, shorn of his titles, begging for leniency. I made plans in my head that were tidy and cold. Revenge felt like a moral mission. I imagined standing across from him in a courtroom, holding a folder of proofs, or breaking his life into compensations that would make the loss even. Months crawled by. I waded through paperwork, letters, and legal consultations. Every creditor call was a drumbeat in my chest. I slept like a person who had given up the right to rest. I kept telling myself the truth was on my side. Somewhere in a drawer, I had discovered inconsistencies, hidden emails, metrics that contradicted the board reports he'd produced. I filed claims. The legal process is slow and antiseptic. It transforms moral certainty into boxes to tick. The coldness of bureaucracy failed to change the way my bones ate. Then, because the world is perverse and full of the kinds of ironies that fiction sells cheap, I found myself running toward a wreck on a rainy night, instead of toward an imagined revenge. It was the kind of habit I have when panic becomes a reflex. You act first and think later. I was returning alone from a late shift at a supermarket where I picked up extra hours, my jacket soaked and my hair plastered to my head. The crosswalk at the corner near the old cinema was a smear of neon and rain. There was the sound of shattering glass, then a body crumpling on the sidewalk and a car that had skidded into a storefront, smoking. My first coherent thought was practical, call an ambulance. But then something in me moved closer, compelled not rationally, but by muscle memory. You help. Kneeling beside the injured man, fitting my hands under his neck to stabilize him until an EMT could insist otherwise, I felt a sudden, insane recognition. Behind the blood and the glass, behind the hollowing bruise of his cheek, he was the man who had signed the documents. Alexei, he was alive, breathing raggedly, and I was the one who had reached for him. Hate has a noise. It isn't silent. When I saw Alexei, the sound of it filled my head with 1,000 small bitings, the stolen rent money, the nights tilting with unpaid bills, the look on my wife's face when she decided she needed to leave. For a moment, only a moment, I considered walking away. Walking away would have been a kind of mercy, the revenge of absence. Let the world take care of him. Let karma, slow and sure, do its work. But then, another memory cut through me, my daughter's small face, brown eyes so clear they looked like questions. She had once pressed her hands to my cheeks and asked me if I would always come back. I couldn't imagine what kind of person I would explain to her if I let another man's death bring me relief. So I helped. I held his head. I felt the life in him, and absurdly, it felt like a rebuke. My hand on his skin, a ledger of what I was and what I could become. The ambulance came. I answered the EMS questions on autopilot, stoic and numb. At the hospital, I watched them wheel him away and felt something I couldn't name. A tiny fissure in the neat, vengeful future I'd been carving for months. Afterwards, I told myself I had done the decent thing and left it at that. But left it at that is a phrase that gathers complications. A few days later, I saw him again, standing too close in the bakery downtown, buying a loaf as if the world hadn't turned to ash for some of us. He didn't meet my eyes. The sight of him was like an old film projected at the wrong aspect ratio. Parts missing, the sound off kilter. Someone who had been a villain in the story I'd told myself was now simply a man, looking tired and oddly small. The first week after the accident, I did what people do. I kept my head down. I took extra shifts, I stapled paper and scheduled meetings. I tried to exist like a person with unfinished laundry and an empty inbox. But in small towns, and in the small neighborhoods of cities where everyone moves in and out of one another's lives, news travels in curious ways. Someone at the supermarket had seen me at the hospital. A woman in the elevator recognized me from a photo in the paper that showed Alexei being assisted. Within 10 days there were whispers, then folded notes. Then the thing I most feared, a plain white envelope slipped under my door. Inside was a single line, typed in precise, "Thank you for not walking away." My stomach tightened. I folded the paper and put it in my pocket. I wanted to rip it up, reply with bile, with a string of the worst things I could think of. But the paper sat quiet and stubborn in my hand. Over the next weeks, the envelopes multiplied. A coffee cup left on my stoop with a note under it. A bouquet of cheap daisies at the office with a card that said sorry in a handwriting that was not mine. Each contact was a small bomb detonating in my cautious equanimity. It would have been simple, maybe even satisfying, to throw everything back at him. The notes, the coffee, the apology, just as by reciprocation. But something else had started to grow. An unease that the person offering the trinkets was asking for something I was not sure I wanted to give. When the lawyer called to say there might be grounds to reopen the case using documents I'd found, emails, internal memos, a spreadsheet with manipulated figures, I felt vindicated in the old way, like armor being put back in place. There was a process to this. Forensic accountants, depositions, sworn statements. For months it was a treadmill in which moral outrage and paperwork mixed until I could no longer tell which fueled which. I filed. I sent the evidence. I sat at a small table and waited for the law to do its measured work. It did, in its way, subpoenas, letters, a preliminary hearing. But the world is messy. Alexei had his own legal counsel, and my files were only part of a larger, obfuscated system of retconning that executives do when they want to keep their hands clean. And then, right when the case seemed finally to be moving toward a hearing, a man knocked on the door of the cheap apartment where I rented a single room. He handed me another envelope. It contained photographs, candid, intrusive photos of my daughter at the park, of my wife leaving with a small suitcase. Someone had been following us, watching our pain to catalog it like data. The paper smelled faintly of copier toner. Under the photos, a note in a printed font. "This can stop. Let me help put it back together." I didn't sleep that night. The photos were a stake through me, a reminder of a life I had been assembling one careful board at a time, and that could be broken again. The note's offer felt like a snare. Was he giving or bargaining? Was this contrition or leverage? 2 days later I saw him at the supermarket again. He was thinner, his suit ill-fitting, a cardigan thrown over one shoulder as if he couldn't commit to a single style. He moved through the aisles with a peculiar, awkward composure, like a man trying to relearn how to be unnoticed. I watched him choose eggs with the same ridiculous deliberation with which he'd once chosen words to manipulate the board. When he reached the register, he turned and looked my way. There was no hatred in his expression. There was fatigue, and something very like humiliation. He mouthed the word sorry so small I might have imagined it. It would have been so easy, again, to strike. Revenge here would have been private, immediate, and delicious. But as I left the store clutching a paper bag of bread that had gone stale by the time I reached home, my hand felt smaller in the world. In the end I called him. It was the last thing I expected to do. Maybe I wanted to measure his contrition. Maybe I wanted to manage it, to be the arbiter of what sorry could mean. He answered on the third ring. His voice was low, careful. "Why did you help me that night?" he asked without preface, a line that was equal parts confession and a test. Because leaving someone to die is not what I learned, I said. It felt both true and insufficient. You could have let me, he said. You could have done what you wanted. You could have been the person everyone expected. Everyone. I almost laughed. The same people who cheered when my life fell apart. He was silent for a long time. When he spoke again, the voice had shifted. I don't know why I signed those things, he said. I don't know who I was then. I was scared, I guess. Maybe cowardly. Maybe I liked the warmth of it because it was easy. People let me get away with it. But I see what I did now. I don't know if sorry is enough. That was a line. Confession followed by absolution seeking. I thought of my daughter's face. I thought of the bills with my name on them. I thought of the lawyer's cautious optimism, and the raw ache that years cannot always mend. I told him I would meet him once, in a public place, with no witnesses and no pretense. He suggested a cafe he said he'd never go to alone. I agreed. We met at noon on a Tuesday. The cafe was thin with light and the kind of small bustle that makes conversations easier to begin and scarcer to commit to. He arrived wearing the same cardigan and a look that belonged to someone who had rehearsed humility in the mirror. When we sat, the air between us was a taut wire waiting for an instrument to pluck it. He did not ask for forgiveness in a cinematic shout. He did not offer compensation as a neat check with a smile. Instead, he told me about the life that had led him to wear the clothes of an antagonist. He spoke of being raised in a house where power meant comfort and where the people in charge taught you how to make other people's failures look like accidents. He told me, halting and earnest, about the small increments by which he normalized lying. He described his own fear of failure, a fear so intense it made cruelty seem like a rational hedge. I believed efficiency mattered more than people, he said. And when you believe that, you start making decisions that cause suffering in neat, impersonal ways. As he spoke, I noticed something else. He meant it. Maybe 70% of me wanted to see him twist his fingers into sorrow and then watch him fail to deliver. But the remaining 30%, stubborn, patient, wanted to know whether a person like him could change at all. He offered documents. He offered to cooperate with my lawyer and pry and open accounts he'd closed. He arranged meetings with former clients who might testify. He handed me the names of people who could corroborate his admission and, in some cases, evidence he claimed would help restore what I had lost. Walking home that day, the weight of the envelope in my bag felt like a live thing. The city seemed more complicated than my rage allowed. I felt the tilt. Justice could come through the court via his confession, or it could be a reconstruction built from his help. Neither option felt purely moral. Things escalated in ways I hadn't scripted. The board at my old company convened a formal inquiry after a whistleblower's email details, of which later suggested had been leaked, forced an external audit. Alexei was placed on leave while accountants shredded months of data into readable patterns. In depositions he stammered and then, finally, told a story that matched mine in crucial details. It was a humiliating retreat. Lawyers on both sides trading the clean language of policy and procedure. But the outcome was not the pure vindication I had imagined. There were settlements, non-disclosure agreements, and a legal calculus that measured loss not in nights of worry, but in things lawyers understand better, percentages and clauses. I was offered a settlement that would prevent me from taking further action in exchange for a smaller, immediate relief. It was a bitter choice, a quick bandage or a long, uncertain path to full repair. I accepted neither cleanly. Instead, I negotiated for the parts that mattered most. Contacts that would help restore my professional reputation, introductions to clients I'd lost, and a public statement, forced, impersonal, but useful, that acknowledged wrongful conduct and promised remedial measures. The firm promised to revise its internal oversight. Alexei agreed to a financial restitution plan, though it required pushing him into bankruptcy hearings and the kind of paperwork that takes the teeth out of drama. It was better than nothing. It was legal, not moral. But there's a private ledger that's not legible in filing cabinets. The life my daughter and my wife had chosen to build without me, that I couldn't repair with a signed statement. I wrote letters. I showed up at school events. I paid for the dance class she'd wanted. I tried to demonstrate that the man who left had been learning how to return. My ex-wife answered once, twice. She was careful. She said the right things. The gap between us remained. Not because of paperwork, but because resentment lives like a shadow in places where trust used to sleep. Throughout this, Alexei's gestures continued. He visited my lawyer, signed paperwork, and gave interviews to investigators that matched the timeline we had assembled. But he also began to do things that unsettled me. Unannounced drops of packages with archival files, messages that suggested someone was still watching the parts of my life that were most tender. He apologized in person in a measured way, then slipped a small envelope with money under my door, a bribe framed as restitution. I returned the cash. You can't buy it back, I told him once, voice low enough that the taxi driver did not hear. You can't stitch that life together with notes and deposits. He didn't argue. He took the bus home like a man walking out of court into an ordinary day. There was a look on his face I couldn't name. Repentance or relief that he had finally been seen for what he was. After the settlement, I started picking up work for people who knew of my expertise and didn't care for corporate affiliations. It was not the same paycheck as before, but it was stable enough to make rent and buy better cereal for my daughter on Saturdays. I learned to answer emails in the mornings and pick her up from school sometimes. We did things that were small and miraculous. We built Lego cities and argued gently about which dinosaur would be the mayor. It was not redemption. It was a scaffolding of something that could become durable if tended. One night, months after the wreck, I found a letter folded into the pages of an old book I kept on a shelf, a place for papers I didn't want to throw away. The letter was from Alexei. It was longer than the notes. He explained, clumsily, how he had watched the life he helped break and had come to understand the texture of what he'd taken. He did not ask me to forgive him. He asked only that I not hate him in a way that crushed me. I can't give you back your life, he wrote, but if there's a way to help you reclaim some of it, let me try. Letters are small things in the architecture of wrongdoing. They can be evidence or they can be paper boats carrying fragile truth. I kept that letter because I didn't know what else to do. I read it on a balcony while my daughter slept. The city's hum a shallow tide below, and my reflection in the glass looked at me like someone who had survived a storm but not yet learned where to rebuild. The months that followed were a slow test of whether people can change and whether restitution can ever match the scale of what was lost. Alexei did what he could inside limited constraints. He testified, arranged meetings, and, in some small ways, opened doors. I met clients he introduced. A few gave me project work. Work turned into respect again, the quiet kind that arrives not from notoriety, but from doing good work and showing up. Money came slowly back. Dignity, too, found its way to the edges of my life. Yet other things had changed irreversibly. My daughter had new rhythms with her mother. Weekends became tight schedules, and sometimes I felt like a guest in her life rather than a parent who belonged. My ex-wife had moved on in certain practical ways. She spoke to me with the honesty of someone rebuilding. She set boundaries that I could not cross and did not want to cross. I learned patience, the dry, circular kind that involves actions instead of speeches. Apologies without repair are noise. Repair is built by consistency. There were nights when the anger came back, sharp, like a cold wind that reopened a scar. I would dream of Alexei in different guises, as the man laughing in a boardroom, as a phantom in my daughter's schoolyard, as a shadow on the thermostat. In the day, he became a muted presence, a man at the corner cafe, the one who had once been the axis of my rage. He tried, in his way, to make amends, but amends are not linear. They are a series of awkward steps where both parties must negotiate the terms of future trust. He could offer documents and money. He could not conjure nights back when my daughter slept in our old apartment, the way the light used to draw patterns on the kitchen tiles. Then something happened that reset the whole moral compass. My daughter came to me one evening, with a school award in her hands, a small certificate for most helpful student that she had won for organizing a food drive. She wanted to celebrate with me. She had written me a note and folded it in half. Daddy, thank you for helping me. That brief note, childish in its grammar, enormous in its weight, was like a fissure of light. It did not erase the past, but it reframed what my work might mean. I had been rescued and had rescued. My actions were not purely reactions to someone else's cruelty. There was something in me that could be the person I promised to be. With small, steady steps I asked for what I needed. More contact with my daughter. Time that was not scheduled into neat blocks. My ex-wife and I negotiated weekends and phone calls like diplomats trying to avoid new wars. We did not rebuild our marriage. We rebuilt a parenting partnership, awkward but functional. In that architecture, I found my bearings. I wasn't vindicated the way I fantasized. I had something else. An honest routine and a daughter who trusted me enough to write thank you in sloppy letters. Meanwhile, Alexei continued to be a presence. Sometimes welcome and sometimes not. He sent another letter. Short this time. I will not bother you again unless you want me to. He wrote that he had taken a job far away, that he was moving to another city to start over, because staying here felt like living in a house with every room filled with other people's broken things. The move was perhaps the right kind of exile, not punishment, but the kind of distance that allows for some people to find each other again separated by time. On the day he left, I ran into him at the bus station. We didn't speak for long. He handed me an envelope and said, "For your daughter, when she is older." Inside was a packet of letters, not apologies to read now, but notes that told the story of what he learned. They were awkward and ordinary, the kind of things a man who had been humbled might write while learning to be accountable. I took them and left without thanking him, because thanks felt both inadequate and performative. I didn't want to give him anything more than a sober account of what was happening in my life. We parted as strangers who had shared a very particular wound. Time, as it always does, moved forward. I worked, I paid my bills. I attended parent-teacher conferences and took my daughter to the dentist. I loved her in the way a man who has learned fragility learns love, deliberately, with attention to detail, and with the patience to repeat himself. The years smoothed certain edges, and I could see that some small progress had been made for everyone. Alexei might be building a smaller life, maybe more honest. I might be reclaiming a career in a different form. My ex-wife had found steadiness. None of it was a triumph song. It was quieter, a sequence of tiny, almost invisible repairs. But the past keeps its echo. Sometimes I would open a drawer and find an old file, and my chest would tighten. Sometimes my daughter would ask a question about why her mother and I were not together, and I would answer with the simplicity that felt true. Because people change, and sometimes those changes mean different houses. I never lied to her about the pain. I told her in a way a child could understand that mistakes have consequences and that people try to fix them. One night, some years after the accident, I received a call that surprised me. It was Alexei. He had been in touch again, cautiously, because his mother had been in the hospital after a fall. He wanted to speak to someone who had once helped him. He wanted a neutral person to sit with in a waiting room. For a moment I considered refusing. Then I thought of my daughter, how a small kindness had anchored her to me. I drove to the hospital parking lot and sat in my car thinking of the ways our obligations sometimes call us when we least expect it. I went in. In the hospital's pale light, Alexei sat with his hands folded. He looked older than his age in the way guilt can age someone. The shoulders rounded, the eyes quieter. We talked, briefly, about small things. He didn't ask for forgiveness. He didn't ask for anything. He simply said, "Thank you for the other night, some time back, for being decent." I nodded. It was not a revelation. It was a human exchange between two people who had once intersected in a terrible way and had learned, perhaps imperfectly, how to negotiate life after harm. When people ask me now what I'd do if given the same choice, whether to save someone who would wreck my life, I tell them the truth. I would save them again. Because the alternative is to let hate dictate the terms of my life. Saving him forced me to answer the question of who I wanted to be. It cost me the confidence of easy answers and required patience. And sometimes that cost was steep. But the result? A life where I could look at my daughter and not be a man who rejoiced at another's ruin. Felt worth it. The settlement and the testimonies restored some of my professional footing. But they could not reopen days that had been taken. My daughter could not forget the nights without a father present. She simply learned that he could be present now in ways that mattered. The law could not heal intimacy, but it could make some forms of restitution possible. The rest was up to the slow work of showing up. And Alexei, he never became a saint. He was never punished in a way that matched his crimes, in the neat moral currency that revenge fantasies demand. He paid fines, lost social standing, and moved away. He tried, awkwardly and often clumsily, to help undo what he'd done. Sometimes his efforts felt manipulative. Sometimes they felt genuine. Time separated motive from act in ways that made it hard to judge. He took responsibility in public and attempted repair in private. Those things did not cancel what had happened, but they created conditions where restitution could, in small increments, be attempted. I kept the letters he left for my daughter in a box on a high shelf. One day she will open them and decide for herself what they mean. Maybe she see a man who learned to wait. Maybe she finds someone trying, imperfectly, to leave some explanatory truth behind. Either way, the choice I made that rainy night created ripples I could not have predicted. It allowed me to remain the kind of person who could teach a child that mercy does not equal weakness. The final irony, if you want to call it that, is how ordinary life becomes after trauma. There are no cinematic closures. There are grocery lists and soccer practices and nights spent fixing a leaking faucet. There is the slow elastic of trust stretching back towards someone who was once the author of your suffering and never snapping cleanly. There is the constant negotiation of memory, which is stubborn and precise and sometimes unforgiving. Sometimes I still dream of the crash. In that dream, the rain comes like a fine net that turns everything into blurred shapes. I find myself at the scene, and there is a choice again. And I always make the same one. I reach for the person on the pavement, regardless of who he is. I do not do it for absolution. I do it because allowing another person to die, even the person who has hurt you most, is to accept that your life will be defined by retribution rather than repair. And I want my life, the life my daughter knows me by, to be a ledger of small, deliberate kindnesses rather than a tombstone for someone else's cruelty. If there is a moral here, it is not tidy. People are capable of breaking others and of being broken. They are capable of being humbled and of being cruel. Sometimes restitution can be arranged in courtrooms. Sometimes it cannot. What we can choose is what those who were wrong decide to become. I chose to become the man who helps. That choice did not erase the pain. It changed its price. Years later, at a child's recital, I watched my daughter stand in a line with other kids, clapping offbeat, full of concentration and joy. In the front row, a woman with a quiet face, my ex-wife, watched too. For a moment, we were both there. Three people who had once been a single small world, now orbiting in careful proximity. The music began and the kids sang a bright, imperfect song. I felt, for once, that the notes were enough. The man who ruined my life still exists in the margins of my story, like a footnote that cannot be crossed out. I saved him because I could not bring myself to let his end be my solace. He cost me things I may never fully reclaim. But there is a version of me now that, in small acts, tried to be larger than my hurt. That version of me is what my daughter knows as Dad, and in the ledger of a life, that counts for something.